Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, it's just going to be a brief gripe because I shot a couple of these, and every time I go deeper, it's just too much. I feel like I need to unpack it in a super lengthy episode. But the short version, the gripe here, is that there's a concern that we as a population, both in my profession as well as just the general public, we're beginning to conflate, a fancy way of saying it, conflate personality with diversity factors or demographics. And the short version of it is, in my opinion, is that there's an increased emphasis in my field, the general public, the news media, those sorts of things, on diversity factors and demographic variables because it's an important movement. Historically, we've not done as good of a job appreciating how those variables in the human condition shape a person and define a person. And this is where we get into semantics and feed into and help shape the personality of the human being. 100%, it's a positive movement for us to begin thinking about that. But like all things human beings touch, we tend to overcorrect. And there is this sort of really ironic thing that is happening, that in celebrating individual variables, diversity factors, demographic variables, which is supposed to deconstruct this sort of more monolithic understanding of an individual, we can then, again, ironically begin to form a new monolithic understanding of that particular diversity variable. Like, it's more informed, maybe, but as we kind of break apart the variable and kind of try to understand that there's a lot of unique experiences that shape the person, we can then, like, once again consolidate around this sort of monolithic understanding of the person based on the fact that they have a diversity variable that we're interested in, right? So, there's tragedy in this. There's tragedy for the individual, too. This is where it's just like, well, I appreciate that you're considering that I'm black or Hispanic. I appreciate that you're considering I'm a male or female or non-binary. I'm appreciating that you are considering that I'm, a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim, right? I'm appreciating that. But in doing so, you're now projecting new things onto me and suggesting I should be operating a certain way because of this variable. And that's like a different version of a guilty not thing that we don't want to do. So two very brief examples I won't go too deep into because anytime I do, it just gets too complicated. It's like, why would someone, say, of a certain race or ethnicity pull up a ladder behind them? If the story here, if they exist in a country where they would be traditionally more marginalized or have less power, why would they pull up a ladder behind them? Well, because personality exists. People are going to people. Is that variable? Is that diversity factor, race and ethnicity? Does that shape and maybe pull away from that tendency a little bit more than the dominant culture would? Yeah, for sure. But at the end of the day, remember, people are going to people. Why is it that women would pull up a ladder behind them or vote against their interests or behave in more kind of narcissistic, self-centered, self-serving ways? Well, gender is an interesting variable. And isn't it interesting when they break the norms of what gender socialization would argue? Yeah, for sure. Is it possible that there are patriarchal systems, or that there is a sort of what I call borrowing of power through the more powerful system by appropriating their methodologies as a means of building oneself that is actually at the disservice, generally speaking, of their gender? Yeah, that's a possibility. But you know what else? At the end of the day, people are going to people. So, we see these. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss, right? I'm trying to hold a dialectical. Two things can be true of both and here. That people are indeed going to people, and we got to give allowances for that. Just as well, we need to be curious about, like, I wonder how their gender, their race, their upbringing, their, able-bodiedness, their religion, their, all these things. We want to consider how all of those collect into the overall whole. But people are going to people. And remember that personality is not just our experiences. There is also something biological, temperamental about it, independent of any of those. Any of those. And I'm not talking just the disordered stuff. All of us. All of us. You go to my neurodiversity episode. Like, there's neurodiversity in our personalities. That's always existed before this term got in vogue. Like, you wonder why we're different? Because neurodiversity, right? Like, that's the thing, independent of our environment. So I guess it's just kind of like, I don't know what use or utility this is, but it's just kind of a call to action for anyone who, really tries to conceptualize people or why things happen. For sure, be curious about the individual. I mean, that's my entire profession is searching for all these really interesting variables that collect into the whole. But do not lose sight of the greater whole, this notion of someone's personality. Because at the end of the day, all those variables, they have their own stories. But if we inadvertently create a monolith, like, well, they should operate this way because of this diversity variable, we're losing the greater, somewhat broad and ill-defined, but useful reality that people have personalities independent. I shouldn't say independent. They are informed by those variables, but they are not dependent on those variables. Or the short way of saying it, again, could use a little bit more definition, but short, nice phrases sometimes are helpful. At the end of the day, people are going to people. And you're not going to so easily sort them into boxes. People are going to people. Personalities are going to personality. So, thanks for listening and watching for whatever this little short episode is about. But as always, stay curious.